We have a couple people that are, if you could go ahead and take your seats, that'd be great. Thank you very much. I want to get started here. Well, the next part of the program here, you heard Jeff Shuren, Director Shuren, say that he has committed significant resources within the agency to the work we're doing collaboratively. And I can tell you that that's not just talk, that's real action. And we have weekly meetings of interactions with leadership from CDRH. And the next person that's coming up is one of the people that we have regular interactions with on multiple times per week and is a key supporter and advocate and driver for the work that we're doing within our public-private partnership, and that's Annie Saha, Director of External Expertise and Partnerships at CDRH. Annie?
I got to pick this way down because I am short. So, thank you, Bill, for the very kind words. So you heard a lot. Actually, I was joking with some folks during the break that between Dr. Califf, Dr. Shuren, and Bill Hawkins in the previous panel, half of my talk's pretty much already been given. So really to talk about a bit about kind of internally what we've been doing within CDRH and certainly how that relates and affects the MDIC collaborations and our external collaborations in the regulatory science space. So as you heard, and Jeff kind of gave you the definition of regulatory science, I'm not going to repeat that or read this slide for you either, but, you know, regulatory science really came into play and as a term and coined by Dr. Hamburg as really an area of focus or an area of interest. It's not that we didn't use science at FDA before that or do research before that, but really a way to really harness and kind of target what are we really talking about and what is really important in terms of regulatory science. So, you know, the agency developed its strategic priorities for regulatory science, which has also included some new ones like strengthening the social and behavioral sciences, as well as the topics about manufacturing and quality, stimulating innovation, and ensuring our readiness to new technologies. And in CDRH, we did an inventory a few years ago of kind of what have we done in the center, whether it was called regulatory science or not, and really adapted the FDA strategic priorities for regulatory science into really device-specific areas. And they're pretty much follow along a lot of the lines of what you saw in the agency report. Of course, we took out the foods priority because we're the Center for Devices, and really looked at here's kind of what we've done, and here's where we're kind of going as sort of a catalog of these different projects. And from there, we really are looking at kind of our whole regulatory science sort of research paradigm and how do we really look at both, you know, what are we funding, what research have we done, and that's really where we started, and moving into how do we really evaluate that to ensure that there's uptake. And it kind of goes back to one of Susan's questions in to the last panel is how do we ensure that whether it's internal folks, our reviewers understand and have used this research and are able to use it in their review process, as well as the external upkeep. So our company is using this. Are they using these tools? Are they using the standards? Is it being uptake? So, and then ultimately, is that impacting our regulatory decision-making? Ultimately, of course, our mission of getting safe and effective medical devices to the patients first in the world. And then from there and where we are now and where I'll end the talk is kind of what we're looking at in terms of where do we go next, what are the areas that we've seen, and I think a lot of what you'll see on that list is pretty common, thematic. A lot of it is what Dr. Califf talked about earlier, of what are the needs and kind of a preview of what we'll be putting out in the next couple of months. So a bit of a sample of some of the work that we're currently ongoing and also tying it into our regulatory science and the MDIC perspective as well. So we've done work in, can you hit the video for me? Thanks. So the video is just going to be on in the background of, it's a YouTube video of a computational model here of simulating electrical impulses. And really the idea here is how do we, if we develop these models and if we're all on the same page and singing from the same sheet, so if a company submits a model that we've seen and understood, we're really helping everybody because we're all talking on the same page and we're not having different conversations about, well, does your model do this? Because we've seen this other model that does that. And we can really help improve the regulatory process and kind of streamline a lot of those discussions that companies and sponsors are really going to be having with our reviewers. I'm not going to go into the science of any of these projects because we have the people who do it are much better at that. Another project, and Kyle, I'm sure, could very much speak to this much more than I can, is about looking at image quality versus dose and how we can improve, clinical trial designs, and looking at how, as technologies have evolved, and how can we improve the safety of imaging by reducing the dose without sacrificing the effectiveness of the diagnosis itself. So how can we really combine those two efforts and really ensure that we aren't compromising anything, but actually are making imaging diagnostics safer by reducing the dose. So we've worked with externals, and all these projects and everything we're doing is with a lot of collaborations with external stakeholders. And we really worked to develop a software package that is being used. It's out on GitHub. I was going to say Google Code, but I was wrong. And it's been used in regulatory submissions. Companies have used it, and we have approved new devices with low reduction of imaging, reduction of dose claims as part of their submission. So this is another way of how regulatory science is in action and really does impact and improve patient safety and ultimately gets better diagnoses to patients. So the new step and kind of where we are now is really looking at how do we evaluate and ensure that this impact, that we really are impactful for our research. This has come up this morning about how do we measure sort of success and what does that look like and how do you ensure that the research is uptaked. So I won't go into this pyramid, but a lot of us are engineers in CDRH, so we think in flow diagrams and pyramids and building blocks and things like that. But really the idea behind this is how do we measure that the research that we're doing ultimately is impacting our internal processes, whether it's developing a new guidance, working in standards organizations, developing those software codes that you've seen, and then is it being used externally? So is industry using it, and then are they citing it in their submissions? And then ultimately, how is that going to impact public health? And really seeing that as anything, whether you're talking about R&D or regulatory science research, you're not going to see an immediate impact, but how can we at least track along the way of that we're on the right track and make sure that we are hitting those milestones and we are being, with our very limited regulatory science resources, that we are, being good stewards and we are trying to provide good ROI for the work that we're doing. And so we did a few case studies, and one is on Bayesian statistics. So the center has put in a lot of effort and in the statistics group on really looking at how can we incorporate Bayesian trial design and what can we do to encourage the use of Bayesian statistics in clinical trial design to help increase the efficiencies of trials by using the priors. So we put out a guidance in 2000, and the final guidance came out in 2010, and we were able to do some data mining to really see, so have people been using this? So we were able to see, and I won't go through all the details of the graph, but really that by the end of 2014, we had over 80 submissions that cited the Bayesian statistics guidance. So this is just citation of the guidance and not other citations potentially of Bayesian, and including 55 unique sponsors. So there's uptake beyond just, 2 or 3. We're really trying, it is a broad stakeholder group, and, certainly we see the application of Bayesian. We put out the draft guidance on adaptive trial design, so it's an area we want to keep continuing to work on. Jeff cited the virtual family earlier, so I certainly won't spend too much time on this, but here's at least a pictorial of what the virtual family looks like. And as Jeff cited, there was also a lot of uptake on this as well, and you can see the graph. And here I'll also correlate what happened with the research milestones and where we started really seeing more of the submissions. So when the project was initiated, and this was actually a collaboration, a cooperative research and development agreement with IDIS in 2005, and then Wolfgang Kahns, the PI, spoke at a conference in 2007, and you can see that's where we really started to see submissions and people citing the virtual family in our submissions. The first major paper was published in 2010, so you see that really big jump between 2009 and 2010. So this is how we're trying to correlate the research milestones and when something important happens and how that really does impact the regulatory process in a way that we can try to improve the regulatory transparency, consistency, and predictability. And finally, I'll talk a bit about where we are now in terms of regulatory science priorities. So we're in the process of developing them. So these are very drafty, and this is very much an evolving field, recognizing that new things and emerging technologies and emerging issues do come up. So we went through a process to sort of look at the areas where our regulatory science needs sort of fit. And there's kind of 4 buckets that we use to describe that. So areas where you're talking about, evaluating the tools, the approaches, new methods to evaluate new devices. Areas where we've had longstanding research questions. Reviewers have had this question. We've seen the same things over and over again in submissions, and we haven't necessarily, they're usually the not sexy topics that people, so it's the things that no one really wants to quite do, but it's an area that's really of importance, and we're seeing it a lot in our deficiencies. It's an area where we really should be spending some resources, and we'll probably have a high ROI. Emerging issues, so that's always going to be the case, and we always enjoy new technologies and new things, and they all bring new challenges. And then another kind of not as exciting but very important category is infrastructure, so developing either the internal infrastructure or the capacity to really either work with big data and other types of things that have come up a lot in the earlier discussions. So this is our draft, very drafty, high level of what we see as sort of the upcoming priorities in regulatory science. So certainly the idea of big data, Dr. Califf brought that up. There's a lot of data out there. How do we harness it and collect it in a way that we can use it for regulatory decision making? Reprocessing certainly is an area of importance. Computational modeling and simulation, not just the models themselves, but how do we validate, quantify, ensure that the right context of use, and certainly working with MDIC is very important for that work. Health information technology, cybersecurity, obviously areas of we're seeing a lot of the news on that, looking at clinical evidence, real-world data, and how do we synthesize all that what we're seeing in the post-market and use that for the next round of pre-market and in our pre-post-market balance. Biocompatibility, looking at new methods for predicting the clinical performance. So Jeff brought up the idea of orthopedics, so certainly better methods like we've done for wear testing to ensure that we are really seeing what's accurate or what's happening in the clinical performance with the preclinical testing. And then sort of that patient-centric, human-centric piece are kind of the last 3. So obviously human factors engineering, you're talking about things like alarm fatigue. Obviously patient preference we know is a very important field and an area where we have high interest in, as well as patient-reported outcomes. And we came up with these because we've seen the data. So here's an example highlighting in terms of patient-reported outcomes. We've really seen a huge spike in the patient-reported outcomes that we've been seeing in submissions. We don't have dedicated resources or staff to really evaluate these PROs. And you can see the spike really happened in 2009 when the draft guidance came out that CDRH was a part of the FDA draft guidance on patient-reported outcomes. So we went from about 20 a year to over 120. So this is an area. So this is how we came up with our priorities, were areas we saw needs. We know there's issues, and we certainly would expect or hope that a similar thing happens as we put out the draft guidance and patient preference. So sort of in summary, and this is really probably preaching to the choir and really preaching to what you heard from Dr. Califf and Dr. Shuren about regulatory science really is important, and it really can make medical devices faster, safer, and more cost-effective. And it really benefits the entire ecosystem. So to patients, access. It improves access because we're improving and speeding the rate to which patients have access to new medical devices. It benefits industry because we're improving predictability. If we all are on the same page and using similar models or standards and talking about similar ideas, it's really going to change that conversation and really help streamline that. And really, it's going to help us reduce the time, the resources for both development, assessment, and the review of devices, and could lead to quicker approvals. It could really shorten and decrease the size of pre-market trials. So the virtual physiological patient that Jeff brought up earlier really has that potential to really game change in the pre-market in terms of clinical trial design, and certainly improving the safety of devices, so you're limiting patient exposure, and the virtual physiological patient could easily do that as well. If you're exposing less patients to treatment before you fully understand it, you're improving patient safety. And final point that we've really kind of hammering home, and I want to reiterate, is that it's all about the collaboration. CDRH, we don't have the resources to do this ourselves. Companies don't, so we really need to come together. And all the work that I just talked about, pretty much every project involves some kind of collaboration, whether it was with academics, with industry, or a combination thereof. So, MDIC is really an important and great way to advance regulatory science, which ultimately is going to impact patients and get devices to market. So with that, I will close. I don't know if I have to take questions. Okay. If anyone does have any questions. No. It is just a list. It is not remotely prioritized within that. It was a combination of, we certainly looked at external stakeholders. MDIC had done a survey about a year ago to some of the stakeholders about regulatory science needs and areas. So we looked at that. We, as I showed with the PRO example, we saw what we had in our data. We had a couple of folks in our pre-market office actually go through this Herculean effort of reviewing all of the pre-market deficiencies in our deficiency letters and look at those and what are the most common themes. And then we've canvassed. We canvassed internally to the different offices of what are the needs that you have, what are the questions you keep seeing over and over again, and also sort of landscape assessment and horizon scanning of what do we see coming down the pike. And so we used all of those inputs to then bring together. We have a subcommittee, the Regulatory Science Subcommittee in the center, and Brett, that's a multi-stakeholder across the center group to really then prioritize. And I mean, we probably started with 40 or 50, 60. We started with 60 needs, thanks Mimi, and ended up at this, 10 that we're sort of looking at. But again, it is evolving.
You make reference to the human factors elements in the medical device world, and yet the MDIC is very specifically and keeps reusing the term computational modeling. The human factors testing of devices, is there any effort to formally look at the adaptation of millions of dollars worth of medical training simulation environments with full-scale duplicate operating rooms, emergency rooms, into which you can actually take those devices, replace the existing devices, and have people evaluate them, be observed, while the people are actually having to take care of, quote, latex or vinyl patients, so that it's not a test in a conference room pushing buttons talking about human factors, but I'm standing over a body trying to do something and having to use the device. And I don't hear any discussion of that.
That could certainly be an area of a collaboration or a project that we do actually have a human factors lab within our Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories to do some.
Yeah. Reinventive. They're laying unused, rentable all over the country.
Okay. Probably the last question.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering, there was so much discussion about collaboration in your talk. What's the single biggest learning that you think you'd put out there about how to make collaborations work optimally, given all of the discussion about public-private partnerships?
Well, it is a lot of effort. I actually, Rochelle Fink's back here somewhere. She's on my staff and is a IP attorney, and we have a lot of work that we do with the technology transfer agreements and our the collaborative work with MDIC. And so, of course, we do have to review everything to ensure, conflict of interest and that we're not talking, getting into a regulatory discussion. We're sticking in the pre-competitive regulatory science space. So there's no perfect answer, and, Dr. Califf kind of alluded to that earlier. So it's a work in progress in terms of what are the best ways, and, we're trying to come up with kind of seeing what's worked and what hasn't worked, even internally with our different collaborations, and see if we can kind of guide our staff on best practices. So, thanks.
Thanks, Annie. And I know there's a lot of questions that people might have. As we go through the day, keep those in mind, and at the end we have some time for questions as well, because now we're going to get into the projects, which we're very proud with the progress we've been making, and I want to have the opportunity to make sure that each of the project teams can share the great work they're doing. So